Alrighty, last area of study. Let's get through it. Aggregate supply policies. So the definition of AS policy refers to any government initiatives that is designed to reduce the cost of production or improve supply conditions for businesses so that Australia's productive capacity and living standards enhance over time. So by increasing AS we hope to fulfill all our domestic economic goals too. So let's go with the first key knowledge point, hey? So the use of aggregate supply policies to complement aggregate demand policies is promoting non-inflationary economic growth over time. It's a lot of words. Anyway, increasing a country's productive capacity helps to increase the amount of products available. When the amount of products increase relative to demand, the abundance of products help ease demand inflation. So let's just say, there used to be 50 units or something and there was 60 people after it. After manipulating supply a bit, maybe there's 100 of those goods available and still 60 or maybe even now 70 or 80 people after it because, well, there's more supply than demand, so people can easily buy it. And also, it's cheaper, so new new people enter the market because now they can afford to buy those goods, well, before they probably couldn't at a higher price. And I think that's what it says here with the last dot point. With the law of demand, when prices drop, the quantity of demand increases. As a result, real GDP increases as more people are consuming more products. There's just so much win happening. So much win. So AS versus AD for economic growth. Well, when you stimulate AD, it only really works in the short run because it brings with it some inflation. And that inflation deters people from spending eventually and brings AD back to where it was prior. So at university they do this thing called the short run and long run aggregate supply line. You might have seen it before. It looks something like this. So yeah, something like that. Open an image in a new tab. Oh wow. So yeah, supply shifts, demand shifts, but in the end it always corrects itself and it always ends up at that same point. Maybe the prices are different, but they're always the same amount of supply. So that's why we don't really like using AD as a form of long-term economic growth. What we do like though is AS for this, because it increases economic activity in long term that is sustainable and does not cause inflationary issues. During the pandemic, for example, AD stimulus was used to combat poor economic activity. So it helped. Like in 2020-21, the economy didn't crash as hard as everyone expected it. I mean, it did. We did have the recession, but it could have been a lot worse. But because we added so much stimulus in the economy, demand outweighed supply, and especially when we had things like computer chip shortages, logistic problems from freighting stuff from overseas, labor shortages that occurred because we shut our borders so we can bring immigrants in. These caused all these aggregate supply problems and caused shortages in the market, which is probably why we have such insane inflation right now. Actually, it's not probably why, it is a reason why we have high inflation right now. Majority of the inflation that we've been experiencing, that high 8s, 7s and 6s we've been getting the last year and a half, 2 years, is all due to supply side conditions mainly. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see aggregate demand shifting, causes prices to go up and GDP to go up. That's great in the short term, but in the long term it's better if your supply shifts to the right, because prices go down and GDP climbs. As you can see here, there's an expansion of demand. This is a much better option. This is what we should be going for, but unfortunately, especially with for example the housing market, we really only focus on boosting demand rather than supply of houses, and that's why we have the issue now of ridiculously high prices for houses. So, we should be experts now on non-price factors of aggregate supply. What are they? This is a key knowledge point number 2 right here. These are the 6. So you've got the quantity and quality of factors of production, the cost of production, productivity growth, technological change, exchange rate, and climatic conditions. So, just from the top of my head, climatic conditions have been pretty poor the last few years. In 2020 we had bushfires, in 2021, 2022 we had severe wet weather events. This year, I don't know what's happening with the weather, but Europe, for example, in America has been seeing some intense heat right now during their summer. So this all applies to AS in some shape or form. Exchange rates, well, the Australian dollar has been falling. So cost of production has gone up for us because, you know, all our intermediate goods come from overseas, such as machinery, capital. We don't really manufacture any goods here, so when we need that sort of stuff, we generally import it from overseas. Those higher import costs increase the cost of production and makes us less willing and able to supply. Ho ho ho. Alright, technological change. Well, with the tightness of the labour market, a lot of businesses are trying to find ways to use technology to replace humans in the production process. It's not really working at the moment, but in the long run it's definitely going to change the way the labour markets operate. There will be people who will be structurally unemployed, especially if you've got people like Tesla, where they're making... is it called an android? No, it's called a robot. They're making a robot. Oh, there's an update, eh? So, eventually what's going to end up happening is basic things like lifting things, grabbing things from high distances. It's all going to be done by a robot. Don't need people. So, and, you know, its efficiency will grow over time. Especially if you see how ChatGPT is working. Imagine once robots get in the picture. It's going to cause some insane change. Well, even ChatGPT is causing some insane change at the moment, isn't it? So, there you go. There's some contemporary examples there. Productivity growth. I can tell you now that productivity sucks balls in Australia. I should probably not say that, but whatever. I can't be bothered right now. Productivity, trading, economics. Alright, that doesn't look like much, but how about if we go like this? Oh man, what's happened to my graphs? Oh, let's refresh this page and see if it fixes it. Ah, there we go. Alright, so you can see that, you know, since 2022 productivity has actually gone below 100, so we are less productive than we used to be. That's not a good sign. So that's causing some supply constraints, maybe contributing to our increased inflation problems. Cost of production has gone up because the tightness of the labour market has put up wage pressures. I'm pretty sure if I look it up. Wage growth, yeah, you can see since 2022 it's been climbing. Job vacancies. Oh, vacancies are falling. That might explain why the unemployment rate's starting to climb. Who knows? Labour costs. Here we go. So cost of production for businesses are definitely going up. There's no doubt about it. So these are all negative supply side conditions. And then the quantity and quality of the factors of production. Well, we got, I think, 160,000 immigrants coming into Australia. I think they're trying to get 400,000. Maybe it is 400,000. I can't remember. Let's take a look. Oh, yeah, there you go. NOM, net overseas migration is forecast to be 400,000 in 22 to 23, so yeah. And then 315,000 by 23-24, so yeah, we're bringing a lot of people in. Just to give you an idea, I think during the pandemic we had negative net migration, so we actually were losing people, which is no surprise. People didn't want to be here, we've shut our borders, so people are leaving the country and not enough people are coming in to replace them. 400,000 new migrants, unbelievable. Alright. So yeah, there you go, there's some non-price factors of AS. Let's move on. So what does AS policies try to seek? Well, we try to increase the quality and quantity of resources, increase productivity, lower cost of production, reduce market failures hopefully. And, you know, it aims to try and lift the efficiency of resource allocation, improve international competitiveness, promote domestic macro stability, so, you know, strong sustainable economic growth, full employment and low inflation, and obviously, well hopefully, support better living standards. So the golden rule, whenever talking about AS policies, so if we choose, something that manipulates one of the non-price factors and it boosts aggregate supply, we need to remember that it increases international competitiveness regardless, because, when supply shifts right, prices go down. When prices go down, they're more attractive for people to buy. Also, it increases our productive capacity, so before we could produce 100, maybe after this policy change we could produce 110, 115, 120, doesn't matter. There's definitely going to be an increase. If supply increases, then the productive capacity has definitely increased. And of course, the willingness and ability to supply, that will definitely go up because, firms wouldn't be doing what they're doing unless they're willing and able to. So productivity and international competitiveness, what does that mean? Competitiveness often refers to a degree of competition that exists amongst different producers of goods and services in their goal to increase the market share. So when we talk about on the international setting, we're just talking about how we increase our market share across the globe rather than just focusing on Australia. And an increase in international competitiveness means Aussie firms are making their products more attractive in the international market through lower prices or improved quality. And you can only get lower prices if they find ways to be more productive. Because being more productive reduces your average cost of production, which then leads to more international competitiveness because, think about it. If it costs them less to produce it, businesses are willing to lower the price. They're willing to lower the price because by dropping the price they're still profitable, but also they'll entice more customers to turn to their product rather than their competition. It's a beautiful system. Alright, so AS policies and the stability of domestic economic activity. So AS policy is designed to expand the nation's productive capacity, you already know that, for increased efficiency and productivity, or it could be from the other non-price factors. This helps businesses to look more attractive in the marketplace and obtain a larger market share from its competitors because we can offer better prices for our goods and hopefully at a higher quality too. So with AS policies in general, price stability should be it should help reduce inflation. Like right now we have 6% inflation I think still. With these AS policies it should help us bring us towards our target of 2 to 3% over the medium term much faster. With strong sustainable economic growth, because we find ways to boost supply, we're able to fulfill more demand without hitting capacity constraints. And because when we find more productive ways to maximize the output with the little inputs that we have, we might actually reduce our environmental damage. And we might be also boosting our intertemporal efficiency. So, AS policies can be strong and sustainable. Also to note that, because we boost AS, prices are lower, so we should see more consumption on local goods and also more net exports because foreigners will tend to buy our stuff over anyone else's because it's relatively cheaper. So yeah, you should see an expansion of aggregate demand. Not a shift in AD, just an expansion because, supply is the non-price factor. Alright, so with full employment, this is a bit funny too. When we're more internationally competitive, this should increase the derived demand for labour, so we should see unemployment levels drop. But if we're talking about supply side, normally you would say that a better use of our resources reduces the pressure on labour in the production process, which should technically reduce the pressure on wages, and at the same time allow us to have lower levels of unemployment without the inflationary pressures that come from it. We also got here long-term benefits outweigh short-term benefits. So yeah, in the short term you might run into some structural unemployment because we change the way our economy works, make it more competitive, and all the dead weight in our society gets shifted away from producing those dud products. And then in the long term, these people who become unemployed will be reskilled, retrained, and hopefully help in the production process of stuff that we actually have a competitive advantage in. And then living standards, you got to remember, if the price of the goods are cheaper, then we have access to more goods and services, so material living standards should increase. Non-material wise, we should see it increase also because we might not need to work as many hours. Nah, not really. Yeah, maybe. You might not need to work as many hours in order to fulfill your needs and wants. You also got the environment should be better off because we're thinking more of intertemporal efficiency, or intertemporal efficiency should be improved. Therefore, there's resources for today and tomorrow's needs. So yeah, beautiful stuff, AOS policies and living standards. So, the next the next key knowledge point is how budgetary policy influences AOS. So I believe there was 4 or 5 different ways we could have gone about this. So you could do training, education, research and development, subsidies, infrastructure and tax reform. They're all good. Like, they all lead to the same thing, boosting AOS, but I'm going to focus on training and education because I believe it's the easiest. If you're looking for an alternative, if you're not a fan of training and education, I usually find infrastructure is another good one to look into. Or even tax reform. So, let's get into it. So with training and education, it increases the quality and the quantity of our labour resources. Also, it might improve the productivity of the business. It helps reduce structural unemployment and also makes us more dynamic efficient because these people can quickly react to the changing needs and wants of society. So we have the Department of Education and Training, also known as DEET, responsible for looking into training and education purposes to boost aggregate supply. And now let's look at some measures they introduced in the last couple of years to try and boost training and education or improve our labour resource. So my 2 favourites to choose from is providing 300,000 free TAFE and vocational education training places. If you make it free, more people are willing to take it up. If more people take it up, there's more skilled workers available for businesses to use in the production process. And if there's more labour relative to demand, we should ease wage pressures, reduce cost of production, therefore increasing AOS. Or, because more people are skilled and they know what they're doing, it should technically increase productivity as that input can produce more output per hour. Either way, ability and willingness to supply increases, international competitiveness increases, and productive capacity increases. Same thing with funding $128.5 million to fund 4,000 additional university places. Our labour resource is better, cost of production is reduced, productivity has increased, the quality and quantity of our labour resource increased. All of these things boost AOS. So yeah, remember those 2. I always try to get students to remember 2 because you never know what might happen. Oh, well, I don't need to go through this again, but pause the screen if you want and get down these details, but I pretty much verbalized it just a few seconds ago. Alright, so how does it link to our goals? Well, with price stability, because productivity is better or the cost of production has reduced, either way cost inflation's gone down for businesses and they might be willing to sell the products cheaper, which in turn reduces inflation overall. Strong sustainable economic growth, you got to remember that increased international competitiveness expands AD and contributes to more sustainable growth in real GDP without the inflationary pressures that normally come from it. And for full employment, increased international competitiveness and economic growth results in more demand for our labour, boosting employment and reducing the rate of unemployment. The boost of spending on training and education will result in an increase in demand for these services, which will require more employees. And as a result, unemployment should get low, and it shouldn't cause as much inflationary pressures because of the low unemployment levels. So we hope. Alright, so next up, the next key knowledge point is all about immigration policies. How does immigration influence aggregate supply? So it affects the size and the age distribution of the population. It affects the size of the labour force and its productivity, the wages behind it, and the participation rate. It affects the effect of policies on productive capacity and aggregate supply, so it actually increases the amount of stuff we can produce. It also improves our international competitiveness and improves our domestic goals, and lastly improves our living standards. You're going to realize that everything we talk about pretty much does the same thing. There's just so much win, as I said earlier, so much win. So the Department of Immigration and Border Protection, DIBP, is responsible for assisting the development and coordination of Australia's immigration policy. Since 1945, more than 7 million people have migrated to Australia. Originally, immigration was used to help Australia to be a better global citizen after World War II, and also help increase its defence capabilities. However, as time moved on, we slowly transformed the rationale for immigration from protection to eventually economic reasons. Skilled migration policies helped Australia increase its population, participation and productivity. We'll go into more details about those a bit later. So, right now in Australia, these are the key areas of shortages that we have. So, people in training and education, accommodation and food services, social assistance providers, people within the scientific community including engineers, computer and software development, and healthcare professionals. Well, the healthcare professionals is a given considering the aging population. We have more old people than young. The healthcare system is taking a strain and we need more workers in order to help those older people get by. Accommodation and food and services, well, they don't usually pay well, so most people shun these jobs because they can do other jobs and get paid more. So we tend to turn to immigration to fulfill those jobs, and usually see backpackers or immigrants from wherever they may be coming in to fill that gap. Alright, anyway, let's move on. So here you can see how since the early 2000s there's been a massive spike in the amount of people we've brought into our country, and it only took a nosedive. Actually, it started slowing down in 2016-17 because we realized that Australia's infrastructure, especially Australia's infrastructure couldn't handle the growth in population, and our real GDP per capita was actually taking a hit. Also, housing prices were going up and people were upset about it, so they cut back immigration to help us boost our supply before we start bringing in additional aggregate demand. And then we had the pandemic, and that obviously with the closing of the borders and people not wanting to stay in our country also resulted in a reduction in the total amount of people coming into our country. In the future, we're going to have some skill shortages in these areas like healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food services, like everything here. There's going to be a shortage. In some areas we're going to see an increase. So we need immigration to fulfill these shortages in the future. That way, well, we can still have a really high standard of living. So with the intergenerational report findings, they found that for the next 40 years, our population growth is going to be lower than the previous 40 years. And then, Australians aged 65 years and older are projected to more than double by 2054-55. We also got the participation rate expected to fall from its current rate of 65.8. I think it's actually was higher than that. Let's double check. Yeah, participation rate is like 66.7 as of July. So our participation rate is expected to fall to 62.4 by 2054-55, so it's not good. We're going to have more people not contributing to our economy, so it's just going to worsen the predicament we're in. So what's the impacts of a reduced workforce? Well, higher cost of production, less productivity, because workers know that businesses need more than they need them, so they might slack off a little bit. And we might see a slowdown in economic growth because we simply cannot produce enough to meet and fulfill the society's demands. Increased levels of skill shortages and potential capacity strains might occur, and government financing will be under added pressure to support the aging population, causes higher taxes or higher budget deficits and a tighter monetary policy. Either way, it's not an attractive economy to walk into, especially like today where we have a tightening of monetary policy and it hasn't been pretty for a lot of Australians. So imagine if that's the new norm, just always having to raise the cash rate. Alright, so what else has the intergenerational report found? Well, our average GDP growth over the next 40 years is going to be lower than the average GDP growth of the previous 40. And then this will translate to growth in material living standards of about 1.5% over the next 40 years. Okie dokie. So here you can see that the blue line, with no immigrants, you can see the population starts to drop off after 2011, but since we've been increasing the amount of immigration we've had since the early 2000s, or actually yes, since the early 2000s apparently to this diagram, you can see that our population is still growing. So yeah, without immigrants we would have gone, our economy would have been definitely smaller than it is today. So population, participation, productivity are the three things considered when we do immigration. So skilled migration and population, while obviously bringing more immigrants increases our population. Therefore, in order to improve AS in the future, our future labour needs to increase the size of our skilled work population and improve the quality. If we can't improve the population and the quality of our labour resources, then there'll be a decrease in the participation rate and most likely economic growth also. So yeah, skilled migration brings up the population. This is just showing you how our population was in the 50s, where majority of people were young, and as we go up in age, the groups get smaller and smaller. While in 2023 you could see here that the biggest group, biggest group here is the 30 to, well, people's in their 30s, and everything else is fairly even. Interesting. Skilled migration and the participation rate. Well, because we're only bringing people who are going to contribute to our economy, each foreigner who comes into our country to live will also increase our participation rate, because they'll be either looking for work or have a job. So between 2000 and 2010, the labour force participation rate increased from 63.1 to 65.9, and that's because of skilled migration. 94% of this increase was due to the arrival of skilled migrants. There you go. Since the participation rate has declined to 65.8, even though we continue to increase our immigration of skilled labour. The reason why there might have been a decline in the participation rate is also due to the aging population. As older Australians retire, we haven't had young people to replace them yet. So maybe that's why the participation rate fell whenever this report was made. I think it was 2016. Alright, without immigration, our participation rate would be 62.4, which is getting us much closer to what the participation rate would be in 2054 apparently. So skilled migration and productivity. While migrants bring in new skills and abilities, they also bring expertise, different cultures, and this may increase our output, because also immigrants tend to work harder because they want to stay in our country, and the only way they can possibly stay is proving their worth in Australia. These are all hypotheticals, by the way. So their entry in Australia is due to ability to fill the gap in Australia's labour market. This will help increase AES beyond the capabilities of no intervention. Increased levels of migration puts a strain on infrastructure and government services, however. When immigration takes place, the government needs to ensure that it will not cause negative issues to society. So yeah, we don't want too many people coming in, because it'll just make things worse. We want to make sure we just get the right amount to make things sustainable. So how's the government trying to create intertemporal efficiency? Well, generally in 2017-18, they changed the way we brought in foreign workers. So businesses had to prove that they couldn't hire someone locally to do the job, from memory. And once they did that, they were allowed to import a worker from overseas, but if they used a foreign worker, we made them pay a levy of between $1,200 and $800. And this levy payment was used to ensure that the money raised would help improve our long-term stability of the economy in the future. So with the temporary skilled visas, we allow foreigners to come in. So it replaced the 457 visas. So these temporary skilled visas allow them to work here, but doesn't allow them to lead to permanent residency. So it's kind of like a use and abuse sort of case. And we're hoping that, you know, by temporarily filling it with a foreign worker, eventually we'll be able to train a local worker to replace that foreign worker as they leave. So yeah, interesting, huh? So some immigration policies that we've done in 23-24. We got 190,000 new skilled migrants, with around 70% allocated to the skilled migration streams. We got temporary graduate holders with select degrees being allowed to stay an extra 2 years post-study. We also got international students working in the aged care sector being exempt from the caps to foreign work. So I don't remember how many hours they're allowed to do, but there's a limit on how much foreign students can work in our country. So those caps don't exist if they're working in aged care, which is fantastic. And also fast-tracking skilled assessment for skilled migrants and increasing the recognition of Indian qualifications in Australia. So yeah, India is the second biggest in terms of population, and I'm pretty sure our mate Albanese here is trying to make strong ties with India so we can get more immigrants from India to help alleviate the capacity constraints that we will have in the future. And who knows, maybe China will get too expensive in terms of manufacturing, and multinational companies will look to India as an alternative because they have quite a big population too, and you know, with a large population comes cheap labor, so maybe they'll be exploited next. Who knows? So immigration and AS increases our supply of labor, places downward pressure on wages, boosts employment and output, help reduce capacity constraints and skill shortages, increase productivity with young skilled labor, and also improve economies of scale. So what happens to our goals and living standards? Well, with price stability, same as with trading and education, should lower the cost of production, increase economies of scale, help alleviate cost inflation. With full employment, help us achieve our Nauru point, since more immigrants reduces wage pressures associated with a tight labour market. Since there are migrants being brought, they are specifically targeting shortages in our economy. It should help reduce inflationary pressures of low unemployment. And with strong sustainable economic growth, the increase in AS will boost GDP without causing inflationary pressures. And also they help replace our aging workforce, therefore improving our intertemporal efficiency. So here's how increased supply of labour due to migration causes the downward pressure of wages. Alright, also Australian born versus overseas born, you could see that the amount of people with degrees or higher qualifications is quite higher through immigration. So immigration allows for better productivity in theory. Impacts of material living standards. Well, the easing of labour shortages reduces the cost of production, allows our products to be cheaper, so we all have access to cheaper goods and services. So boosting the labour force participation rates will also mean that more people have a chance to earn an income, which should improve their living standards too. Also helps keep wage costs lower than otherwise, improving the real purchasing power of higher incomes. So, you know, making sure prices stay relative so people on higher incomes could actually get more than less. Non-material living standard wise, skilled migration has made it far more vibrant, for a far more vibrant, creative, innovative, tolerant, rich and interesting multicultural society, improving our well-being. But on the other hand, it also creates segregation, so lack of social cohesion, because certain groups like to stay within their certain groups. It's just a force of habit. It's who we are as a society. What else? Immigration also increases a strain on our infrastructure, so traffic congestion, reduced leisure time or family, and also it presents environmental challenges because more people means more consumption might lead to a reduction in our environmental quality. Alright, so the next key knowledge point is trade liberalization. What is it? It's any government policy initiative that is designed to promote free trade or reduce restrictions or barriers to the free trade with other countries. So in other words, it's making it easier to trade between nations. That's what trade liberalization is all about. So in the past we used to have these things called quotas, which limit the amount that comes into the country. So if you have a limit on the supply and demand is growing, you realize prices go up. So that's what made foreign products unattractive. Also we did tariffs, which is a tax levied on imports to artificially increase the price of these products, making them unattractive. And also sometimes we subsidize the production of local goods to artificially lower the price of local production, which made local goods more attractive than foreign goods. So in the short term there was a lot of benefit to be obtained because you're keeping work within Australia, but in the long term it actually made us a lot worse off when we had all these protection measures in place. So trade liberalization involves cutting tariffs, reducing subsidies and industry assistance, abolishing import quotas, increasing the number of free trade agreements and scaling back other protective devices. So making Australians more, more reliant on themselves in order to survive in the global economy. So yeah, increasing competition from imports of goods and services forces local firms to lower prices and improve the quality of products, encouraging specialization of their production in areas of comparative cost advantage. So what we're saying is just focusing on areas where we actually can beat foreigners in production will help minimize the opportunity cost and allow firms to sell their products more competitively at a lower price. Also provides large-scale production that lowers the average unit cost of production. In other words, economies of scale. And through economies of scale, we get lower prices, so our exports are more attractive. Trade liberalization also restructures operation, lift efficiency and cut their production costs, allowing firms to sell at a lower price, more competitive price also. Also, trade liberalization allows us to gain access to the latest technology at the lowest cost possible, which helps us in turn improve our technical efficiency and be more competitive. It also encourages firms to think creatively, provide better service and meet changing customer needs, which should help improve our international competitiveness. So yeah, trade liberalization does a lot of good things for our economy. Don't need that. So we still have tariffs in place. For example, luxury car tax is 33%. Stuff from Russia and Belarus gets charged at 35%. Crude oil, we put a 5% tax on that. GST on imports greater than 1,000 gets hit by 10%. And all foreign foods essentially gets a 5% tax. So short-term impacts of trade liberalization. So it's not pretty. Like at the start, we realized that a lot of industries die out because we realized we're not as competitive as foreigners in terms of producing certain goods and services. Also, our resources are not allocated well because we're producing stuff that we probably aren't that great in producing, and the competition is flushing us out. Also, agri supply is bound to fall because, well, if they're not buying Australian goods because foreign goods are much cheaper and much better, local industries will die off, so our supply will fall with it. For full employment, it'll have a negative impact because the increase in business shutdowns will cause a rise in our unemployment levels. Price stability should improve technically because with cheaper foreign products it should reduce the general price levels of all goods and services we consume in Australia. And with strong sustainable economic growth, it'll have a negative impact since we're turning to more cheaper and better imports, which are leakages in our economy, which has a negative impact on GDP. But in the long term, we gain international competitiveness as we start producing goods that we have a comparative or competitive advantage in. Therefore, we start allocating our resources towards stuff that we actually are good at producing, therefore being more allocative efficient, productive efficient, dynamic efficient, and hopefully intertemporal efficient. That one's a bit of a grey area. With agri supply, we should see an increase since now we're only focusing on producing goods we're actually good at, where we actually have an advantage in. So productivity, economies of scale, cost of production, the quality of our resources should all see an improvement. Full employment, yes, at the start unemployment levels increase, but because of the way we are producing now, we're focusing on stuff we have a competitive advantage in, we should see the derived demand for labour climb, and therefore unemployment levels fall off as international competitiveness increases. Price stability should also increase because now we're working to sell our goods at a cheaper price, which reduces the general prices of goods and services. And strong sustainable economic growth should increase because net exports should increase through the specialisation of Australian products that can actually compete on the international setting, which increases our GDP. So here you can see that the average rate of inflation in the 1970s and 80s, 90s was on average about 9.3%, but once we started doing trade liberalisation, you can see that inflation fell to around on average 2%. And that's the benefits of trade liberalisation. So increased productivity, stimulate growth, increased dynamic, productive and allocative efficiencies, focus on production in products we have a competitive advantage in, medical equipment, tourism, education, financial services, etc., etc. Makes cost of production cheaper, and protection distorted the price mechanism also. So you can see here, as we've reduced the tariffs, we've also increased the number of free trade agreements that we signed up for with other nations. Free trade agreements mean that we put no barriers between trade between the two nations. So you can see here that textiles used to have a huge tariff in the 90s, up to 180%, but then dipped down to almost nothing these days. Same thing with passenger motor vehicles. Once we got down to 20%, we realized that Australian car manufacturing couldn't really compete with foreign cars, and by 2017 onwards, Australian car manufacturing died. And our tariffs are sitting, looks like about 5% still. While agricultural tariffs have decreased also, because we realise now that Australia is pretty good at competing on the international front in terms of our food production, so we barely have a tariff on it. Pretty sure that's at 5% also. And white goods, we used to manufacture a lot of stuff in Australia, but that's gone downhill since the 1990s, and you can see here that they're effectively non-existent now because we don't make anything, we just import all the fridges and microwaves and stuff like that we need. So you can see here the timeline of like all the free trade agreements that we've done. Started off with like New Zealand in 1983, we introduced Singapore in 2003, we looked at stuff with the United States and Thailand in 2005, and yeah, it's been growing and growing ever since. So we've already gone through this, but just pause the screen and read into it if you want more detail about how trade liberalisation increases strong sustainable economic growth. Same thing with full employment. Same thing with living standards. So next up we got environmental policies. So we need to see what the difference is between market-based versus interventionist approaches to managing supply side of the economy. So market-based approaches is where you just allow the free market to operate how it is, reduce as much red tape involved or regulations, so to allow people just to do whatever they want. While interventionist approach is where the government gets involved and actively looks at ways to manipulate the way the economy runs to achieve certain outcomes. If you really want the history of how trade liberalisation worked in Australia, feel free to pause and read this. But essentially, protection policies made us a little complacent, inefficient, artificially rose the price of goods and services while foreign products were naturally cheaper. So once we got rid of all those barriers in place, we've realised that Australians' living standards have increased because now we have access to cheaper goods and services, and we're exporting stuff that we actually are competitive in. So it's been a positive benefit since we've changed the way we've been doing things since the 80s. Alright, so market-based environmental strategy. So, in summary, they just said there will be a reduction in the nation's wheat, more expensive natural disasters, decrease the output over the next 40 years by about $135 to $423 billion. Whilst faster non-inflationary rates of growth in GDP may be economically sustainable now, there is still a nagging thought that this is not environmentally sustainable, which is so true. So when promoting better agri-supply conditions, it's also vital that the government, policy makers, businesses and consumers take a far broader and longer term view of the concept of sustainability and consider the question of intertemporal efficiency in the use of its resources. So, making sure we meet the needs and wants of today as well as tomorrow, because natural resources have a limited amount and our needs and wants are unlimited. So we need to find ways to set up policies in place that reduces the market failure associated with the way we do things in our economy. So climate change is threatening the way of life, whether through extreme weather changes, air quality, environmental changes, heat waves, acid rain, etc, etc. And you can see here that the global temperatures are rising since the 1980s, and it's been consistently rising, which is quite alarming. And if you look here, yeah, the United States and China are big polluters, but compared to Australia, we are polluting more per capita, which means per person we're putting more CO2 out there than the biggest polluters in the world, which is not good. Not good at all. And the main source of our carbon emissions, electricity, stationary energy, transport, agriculture, fugitive emissions, I have no idea what that is, industrial processes, waste, land use, and land use change and forestry. So a market-based environmental policy can include carbon taxes, tradable pollution permits and subsidies that are designed to positively change the behavior of producers and consumers of the goods and services that damage the environment. So those are your three options. I am going to be focusing on carbon taxes. So yeah, all of these policies are aimed to manipulate the way the market operates to reduce our environmental footprint. So with the use of carbon tax, we are imposing a tax or a levy on firms that produce CO2 emissions, and the intent is to increase their cost of production to make them think twice about how much of these particular goods and services they produce, or looking at alternative ways to produce their goods and services that result in less CO2 emissions. So by doing this, just like back in Unit 3, Area Study 1, when we did how do taxes reduce negative externalities, it's the same deal here. When we put a carbon tax on, it'll actually reduce supply, because now cost of production has increased, which reduces the willingness and able to supply. So we'll notice that the final goods of these products are higher and the quantities are lower, which is definitely what the government wants. So today, nearly 30 countries, including the European Union, Canada, China, Denmark, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden and the UK have a carbon tax designed to reduce emissions and climate change and improve intertemporal efficiency. Unfortunately, Australia doesn't have one anymore, but we used to back in 2012 to 14 under the Julia Gillard regime, but that was scrapped as soon as Tony Abbott came into play. So we used to charge about $23 per tonne of CO2 that was released into the atmosphere, and it rose by 2.5% each year of that cost. Because the tax drove up electricity charges as well as the price of transport and food, it caused business closures and the loss of some jobs. The government decided to compensate low-income earners and some polluting businesses using the $7 billion collected annually in tax revenue to cover them. However, this reduced the effectiveness of the tax in changing the behaviour of households and businesses. The incoming coalition government in 2014 ditched the carbon tax and replaced it with the policy called Direct Action on Climate Change with its Emission Reduction Fund. Here, firms bid for financial support in a reverse auction arrangement where the government's money went to those promising the biggest reduction for the lowest cost. So what's the short-term and long-term impacts on agri-supply when you do a carbon tax? Well, you got to remember, right? Because the tax has increased the cost of production, in the short term you'll see businesses die off as these costs become unfeasible to produce, and consumers will turn to alternative products which are cheaper as a result of the artificially high prices that the carbon tax put on those goods. We might also see some businesses outsource their work and not produce in Australia and look for other nations where they have more relaxed environmental policies to continue their production of those goods and services. So yeah, in the short run, it does not help our living standards at all, or our aggregate supply. It actually reduces our aggregate supply. And material living standards decrease because, well, the cost of these goods and services go up. But non-material living standards should improve because our environment starts to have a better, well, it has a better chance of surviving and thriving rather than dying off. But you know, the the decrease in the production of goods and services drive up the prices, which might, in a non-material sense, increase stress amongst our households. So, in summary, short-term impacts of environmental policies, increased cost of production, decrease our international competitiveness, and the deaths of some industries in Australia will cause structural unemployment to climb. Oh yeah, and then here you go. Higher unemployment levels lead to induced stress, feeling of personal failure, worsening of mental well-being. But in the long term, we should see that material living standards increase as we find alternative forms of production which are more environmentally friendly. As you know, the higher cost of production using carbon, producing carbon, will force some industries to find new ways to produce goods and services, which is more cost effective but also reduces their CO2 emissions. So yeah, these redistributive effects will allow our environment to thrive also, and hopefully allow us to produce at a similar level than what we did before the carbon tax was introduced. So those unemployed in the short run will now be allocated in areas that provide more benefits to society, and you know, non-material living standards will improve because environmental policies will reduce the negative impact production has on the environment. And that's it. That's everything you need to know about aggregate supply. It's a lot, but it's pretty much the same bread and butter approach. If aggregate supply increases, then our non-price factors improve, then our inflationary pressures go down, our environmental footprint goes down, our intertemporal efficiency increases, and overall we should get more goods and services available at a cheaper price. So yeah, best of luck for your last area study, and I'll see you for exam revision maybe. Catches.